October 12, 1918, 0630, Hill, 269, Argonne Forest, France. Corporal Frank Seibold of the 82nd Division pressed himself against the cold earth and watched his platoon dissolve under German machine gun fire 100 yards ahead. The attack had begun 20 minutes ago. 3 companies rose from their positions and advanced across the open slope. No artillery preparation, no smoke screen, no tanks, just men with rifles walking uphill against fortified machine gun nests. Now the slope was littered with motionless bodies in khaki, while the survivors lay where the fire caught them, unable to advance or retreat. Seibold had been a schoolteacher from Georgia. 8 months ago, he didn't know what a real rifle looked like. In training camp, officers, many of whom had never seen combat themselves, explained a simple truth. The American soldier needs none of the tricks of European positional warfare. Marching infantry, bayonet charges, aggressive momentum, these win battles. General Pershing had forbidden even training troops in trench warfare tactics, calling it defensive thinking. His army would fight in the open field like real soldiers. But now there was no open field. There was only this killing slope, cratered and tangled with barbed wire, swept by half a dozen fortified positions the Germans had built over 4 years. And the order remained the same: stand up and move forward. What this Georgia schoolteacher didn't understand, what thousands of American soldiers dying in these weeks through the forests and ravines of the Argonne didn't comprehend, was that their command was fighting an entirely different war. Not the one that had raged in Europe since 1914. The American army had shipped across the ocean a belief that war is a clash of wills, where victory goes to those willing to pay any price for the offensive. Europe, after 4 years of bloody slaughter, had reached a different conclusion. War is an industrial machine, where victory goes to those who use cover, fire, and defense more intelligently. The American doctrine of open warfare would turn the autumn campaign of 1918 into a bloodbath, where divisions lost half their strength in weeks. But this very doctrine, this mad, un-European stubbornness to attack again and again, regardless of losses, would become the psychological hammer that broke the German army's will. Because the Germans knew how to defend, but they had forgotten how to believe in victory, and the Americans still believed. The collision between American doctrine and European reality was not an accident of miscommunication. It was the inevitable consequence of 2 fundamentally incompatible understandings of what modern war had become. When John J. Pershing arrived in France in June 1917 with his small staff, he carried with him a vision forged in the American West and the Philippines. War as a test of aggressive spirit, where the side willing to seize the initiative and press forward would shatter the enemy's cohesion. He looked at the Western Front, the 400 miles of trenches from the Swiss border to the Channel coast, where millions had died for advances measured in yards, and saw not an evolution in warfare, but a failure of will. The French and British had been broken by their losses, he believed. They had surrendered the offensive to the defensive. They had forgotten that wars are won by attacking. The mathematics that would measure this doctrinal collision were already being written in blood and bodies. In the 6 months between June and November 1918, American forces would suffer approximately 320,000 casualties, killed, wounded, missing, or captured. 53,000 would die in combat. For perspective, these losses came in roughly half the time the United States had been formally at war, and in a fraction of the territory where American units actually engaged in sustained combat. The casualty rate per day of major operations would exceed that of the Union Army at Cold Harbor or Fredericksburg, The difference was that in 1918, these losses represented not defeat, but a strategic calculation. That American manpower and industrial capacity could sustain losses that would break any European combatant's remaining will to fight. This calculation rested on a premise that Pershing stated explicitly in his training directives and operational orders. Rifle fire and the bayonet, delivered by men advancing in the open, remained the decisive weapons of warfare. Everything else, artillery, machine guns, tanks, gas, aircraft, was auxiliary. His field service regulations, which governed American tactical doctrine, emphasized fire superiority achieved by individual marksmen shooting from standing or kneeling positions. The regulations devoted extensive attention to bayonet technique. They treated the machine gun as a specialized weapon for specific situations, not as the defining instrument of modern combat. Most tellingly, they explicitly discouraged troops from seeking cover or adopting what Pershing called the trench mentality of static defense. What Pershing did not know, what he could not accept, even when French and British commanders tried to explain, was that the rifle and bayonet had already been made obsolete by the industrial mathematics of firepower. A single German MG-08 machine gun, properly sighted and supplied, could fire 450 rounds per minute to an effective range of 2,000 yards. The gun's water-cooled barrel allowed sustained fire without overheating. Its belt-fed mechanism eliminated the need for constant reloading. 3 men operating one MG-08 could deliver more accurate fire than a company of riflemen. And the German army, by 1918, had integrated machine guns into its defensive doctrine at a density of 1 gun per 50 yards of front in major defensive positions. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Any infantry formation attempting to cross open ground against prepared machine gun positions would be destroyed before closing to rifle range, much less bayonet range. The French had learned this at a cost of 1.4 million casualties in 1914-1915. The British had learned it at the Somme, where 57,000 men fell on the first day of the offensive. The Germans had learned it in their own offensives in 1918, where initial breakthroughs collapsed when follow-on waves encountered intact defensive positions. By the time American divisions began arriving in France in significant numbers in spring 1918, the doctrinal consensus among European armies was clear. Infantry attacking across open ground required overwhelming artillery preparation to suppress defensive fire. Combined arms coordination with tanks and aircraft to suppress strong points, and infiltration tactics that avoided direct frontal assaults against prepared positions. Pershing rejected all of this. He saw in it the exhaustion and defeatism of armies that had lost their offensive spirit. He insisted that American troops would be trained differently, would fight differently, and would succeed where Europeans had failed because American soldiers possessed superior morale and marksmanship. His force would break the stalemate through the application of aggressive infantry tactics. He would prove that courage and initiative could overcome defensive firepower. The test of this theory would come at Belleau Wood. June 1st, 1918. The German spring offensive had driven a salient deep into Allied lines, bringing their artillery within range of Paris for the first time since 1914. French forces were retreating. On the road to Paris, exhausted French colonial troops passed American Marines of the 4th Brigade moving forward toward a forest called Belleau Wood, the Wood of Beautiful Waters. A French officer advised the Marine commander to retreat. Captain Lloyd Williams replied that the Marines had just arrived and had no intention of going back. What Williams didn't know was that Belleau Wood contained not a retreating enemy, but a carefully prepared defensive position held by German veterans of the 461st Imperial German Infantry Regiment. Over the preceding days, these veterans had transformed the wood into a fortress. Interlocking machine gun positions sited to create crossfires across every approach, communication trenches connecting strong points, artillery pre-registered on all likely assembly areas. The Germans were not retreating. They were waiting. On June 6th, the Marines attacked. Their orders reflected Pershing's doctrine: advance in extended lines across open ground, close with the enemy, and destroy him with rifle fire and bayonet. No creeping barrage, no tanks, no infiltration tactics. The Marines formed up in assault waves and moved forward across wheat fields toward the wood. German machine gunners opened fire at 800 yards. The Marines kept walking. At 600 yards, more guns opened up. Men began falling, but the lines kept moving forward. By the time the assault waves reached 200 yards from the German positions, the wheat fields were carpeted with bodies. Of the roughly 9,500 Marines who participated in the initial assault phases, approximately 1,087 became casualties on the first day. The highest single-day loss in Marine Corps history to that date. Companies that entered the assault with 250 men came out with 80. The Marines eventually took Belleau Wood, but it required 3 weeks of brutal fighting, not the breakthrough that Pershing's doctrine predicted. The Marines learned, at the cost of approximately 50% casualties, that frontal assaults against prepared positions resulted in annihilation. They learned to use cover, to advance by fire and maneuver, to call for artillery support before attacking. They learned, in other words, the lessons that European armies had absorbed years earlier. But here was the critical difference. The Marines' losses at Belleau Wood didn't break American will. The American High Command didn't revise its doctrine. Pershing cited Belleau Wood as proof that American offensive spirit could prevail. The battle became a symbol of Marine toughness and determination. The catastrophic casualties were reframed as the price of victory. And when American divisions moved into line for major operations later that year, they brought the same doctrine with them. September 12, 1918. The first major American independent operation. Pershing finally had his chance to prove that American methods could succeed where European armies had stalemated. The target was the Saint-Mihiel salient, a German-held bulge in the Allied lines that had existed since 1914. American First Army, 550,000 American troops, the largest American force ever committed to battle under a single command, would attack from 3 sides and pinch off the salient. The attack succeeded brilliantly. Within 4 days, American forces had eliminated the salient, captured 15,000 prisoners, and seized 450 guns. Pershing proclaimed it proof that open warfare tactics could break the trench deadlock. American newspapers celebrated the triumph of American arms over German militarism. What the newspapers didn't report, and what Pershing didn't acknowledge, was that German forces had already begun withdrawing from the salient when the American attack commenced. German High Command had recognized the salient's vulnerability and ordered a strategic retreat to more defensible positions on the Hindenburg Line. American forces were attacking an enemy in the process of withdrawing. The operation was less a breakthrough than a pursuit of a retreating force, but the real test came in the logistics. Saint-Mihiel demonstrated American organizational capacity to mass and supply a force of over 500,000 men for a coordinated offensive. This required moving 600,000 tons of supplies over inadequate roads, coordinating artillery support from over 3,000 guns, and managing the movement of divisions in and out of line. The American supply system, built from scratch in 16 months, handled the load. The tonnage delivered, the meals provided, the ammunition expended, all confirmed that American industrial and organizational capacity could sustain operations that would have exhausted any European combatant at this stage of the war. Yet the tactical lessons of Saint-Mihiel reinforced Pershing's mistaken convictions. Because the attack succeeded rapidly and with relatively light casualties, about 7,000 American casualties, Pershing saw it as validation of open warfare doctrine. He didn't see that the limited casualties resulted from attacking a withdrawing enemy, not from the superiority of American tactics. The stage was set for the Meuse-Argonne, where American forces would face not a retreating enemy, but the strongest German defensive positions on the Western Front. September 26, 1918, 0530. The largest American offensive of the war began with an artillery barrage from 2,700 guns. American First Army, now expanded to over 600,000 men, attacked northward through the Argonne Forest and along the Meuse River Valley. The objective was to break through German defenses, cut the Sedan-Mézières railroad that supplied the German army's northern positions, and force a general German collapse. The German defenses consisted of 4 prepared lines stretching 20 miles deep. The first line, the Stellung Zone, incorporated every lesson learned in 4 years of defensive warfare. Mutually supporting strong points, machine gun nests sited in depth to create killing zones, artillery observers positioned to call fire on any penetration, communication trenches allowing rapid reinforcement. Behind it lay 3 more defensive lines of increasing strength. The fourth line, the Kriemhilde Stellung, was considered by German commanders to be impregnable. American forces attacked using Pershing's doctrine, infantry advancing in waves across open ground, relying on rifle fire and aggressive momentum to overwhelm defensive positions. The results were predictable. Divisions attacking through the Argonne Forest encountered German machine gun positions so skillfully concealed that American troops walked past them, only to be cut down from behind. Units attempting to advance along the Meuse Valley found themselves caught in crossfires from heights on both sides of the river. By the end of the first day, American forces had advanced roughly 3 miles against the first German defensive line, at a cost of approximately 4,500 casualties. The offensive continued for 47 days. The casualty statistics reveal the industrial nature of the slaughter. American forces suffered approximately 26,277 killed in action and 95,686 wounded. Total casualties of 122,063 men. Daily casualty rates averaged 2,600 men. Some divisions suffered over 100% replacement rates, meaning every man in the division was killed or wounded and had to be replaced, some positions multiple times. The 77th Division entered the Argonne with 25,000 men. It suffered 9,194 casualties. The 1st Division, considered among the best trained American units, lost over 8,000 men. The 42nd Rainbow Division suffered casualties approaching 50% of its strength. These losses exceeded anything the American Army had experienced in its history. They were comparable to Union casualties in the Wilderness Campaign of 1864, but sustained over a longer period and across a broader front. They represented a daily expenditure of American lives at rates that would have forced any European power to reconsider its offensive. Pershing did not reconsider. He doubled down. When division commanders requested permission to suspend attacks and reorganize, Pershing relieved them and ordered their successors to maintain offensive pressure. When units became so disorganized that command and control collapsed, Pershing rotated fresh divisions into line and ordered them to attack. When logistical failures left units without food, water, or ammunition, Pershing blamed subordinate commanders and demanded renewed offensive action. The doctrine was killing American soldiers at industrial rates. but it was also destroying the German army's will to continue fighting. What Pershing understood, perhaps intuitively rather than analytically, was that by autumn 1918, German military effectiveness depended not on tactical skill or defensive preparation, but on psychological endurance. The German army of 1918 was not the army of 1914. It had been bled white by 4 years of attrition. Its best officers and NCOs were dead. Its replacements were teenagers and middle-aged men. Its divisions were skeletal formations operating at half strength. Most critically, it had lost faith in victory. The German spring offensive of 1918 had been Germany's last gamble, a massive attack designed to break Allied lines before American reinforcements arrived in decisive numbers. The offensive succeeded tactically, driving deep salients into Allied positions. But it failed strategically. German forces couldn't exploit their breakthroughs. They lacked the reserves to sustain offensive operations. By summer, the offensive had collapsed, and Germany was back on the defensive, now facing not just British and French forces, but over 1 million fresh American troops. German soldiers could see the arithmetic of defeat. Every week brought reports of more American divisions arriving in France. Every engagement revealed Americans equipped with seemingly unlimited ammunition and supplies. Every captured American revealed a soldier who had been a civilian months earlier, proof that America's mobilization had barely begun. The German soldier, after 4 years of war, shortages, and casualties, now faced an enemy who had just started fighting and possessed industrial resources that dwarfed Germany's capacity. Into this equation of exhaustion and despair came the American offensive in the Meuse-Argonne. German defenders could see American units attacking with a recklessness that defied military logic. American soldiers advanced across open ground into machine gun fire, were cut down, and were replaced by fresh units that attacked again. When American attacks were repulsed, they reformed and attacked again the next day. The Americans seemed to possess either suicidal courage or ignorance of proper military tactics. And from the German perspective, the distinction didn't matter. What mattered was that the attacks kept coming. German commanders reported to high command that American tactics were primitive and costly. They noted that American units suffered excessive casualties and exhibited poor combined arms coordination. But these reports included a crucial observation. American offensive pressure never ceased. Unlike British or French offensives, which halted when casualties reached unsustainable levels, American attacks continued regardless of losses. The Americans were willing to accept casualty rates that would have forced any European army to suspend operations. This created a psychological crisis for German defenders. They could repulse American attacks. They could inflict devastating casualties. But they couldn't make the attacks stop, and every day the attacks continued. German casualties mounted, German supplies dwindled, and German hopes for survival diminished. The German soldier could kill 10 Americans and see 20 more advance. He could hold his position today and face another attack tomorrow. He could see that victory was mathematically impossible. That even if he survived today's battle, eventually the sheer mass of American manpower would overwhelm his position. By late October 1918, German defensive resistance began collapsing. Not because American tactics had improved, but because German morale had broken. Units that had held positions against British and French attacks for years began surrendering to American units. German officers reported that their men had lost the will to continue fighting. Desertions increased. Defensive positions that should have held for weeks fell in days. The German High Command understood the equation. On October 26th, General Ludendorff presented his analysis to the German government. The army could not sustain current casualty rates. Morale was collapsing, and American reinforcements were arriving faster than Germany could replace its losses. He recommended immediate armistice negotiations. On November 11, 1918, the armistice took effect. The war ended. After the armistice, German military leaders conducted extensive after-action analyses, attempting to understand their defeat. These analyses reveal how German commanders viewed American military performance. General von Kuhl, Chief of Staff to Crown Prince Ruprecht, wrote in his post-war memoir that American tactical methods were crude and resulted in unnecessary casualties. He noted that American units frequently attacked without adequate artillery preparation, failed to use terrain effectively, and exhibited poor fire discipline. But he concluded that American tactical deficiencies were irrelevant to the strategic outcome, because American industrial capacity and manpower reserves allowed them to sustain losses that would have destroyed any European army. The Americans, he wrote, fought a war of material resources rather than tactical skill. And in such a war, the side with greater resources would inevitably prevail. General Max von Gallwitz, commander of German forces in the Argonne, provided a more pointed assessment. He testified that American attacks in the Meuse-Argonne were marked by inexperience and heavy losses, but that the continuous nature of American offensive pressure made them more dangerous than technically superior but intermittent British and French attacks. German defenders, he explained, could anticipate and prepare for British and French offensives, which followed predictable patterns of artillery preparation and limited objectives. American attacks, by contrast, seemed to follow no pattern except relentless forward pressure. This made them psychologically exhausting for German defenders, who could never rest or predict when the next attack would come. Perhaps the most revealing assessment came from Crown Prince Wilhelm, nominal commander of the German forces facing the American offensive. In his memoir, written years after the war, he described American tactics as brave to the point of recklessness, and noted that American soldiers seemed indifferent to casualties that would have broken veteran European units. But he identified the decisive factor as psychological rather than tactical. By autumn 1918, he wrote, German soldiers no longer believed they could win the war, while American soldiers still believed in victory. This difference in psychological state, he argued, mattered more than differences in tactical skill or equipment. The German assessments reveal an important truth about the American experience in World War I. Pershing's doctrine was simultaneously catastrophically flawed and strategically effective. It was flawed because it ignored the tactical realities of industrial warfare, resulting in casualties that better doctrine could have reduced. It was effective because it exploited a unique historical moment when American industrial capacity and manpower reserves could sustain losses that would break any other combatant's will, and when the German army's psychological exhaustion made it vulnerable to exactly the kind of relentless offensive pressure that American doctrine emphasized. The final accounting of the Meuse-Argonne offensive reveals both the human cost and strategic impact of American doctrine. In 47 days of combat, American First Army advanced roughly 34 miles, captured 16,000 prisoners, and seized 468 guns. The advance cut the Sedan-Mézières Railroad, forcing German forces to the north to rely on secondary supply routes and effectively ending their ability to sustain defensive operations. This operational success contributed directly to the German decision to seek armistice. The cost was 26,277 American soldiers killed in action, with another 95,786 wounded. To provide perspective, in 6 weeks of fighting in a sector roughly 20 miles wide, American forces suffered casualties equivalent to the entire Marine Corps' strength in 1917. The casualty rate per day exceeded that of any major American battle in the Civil War, As a percentage of forces engaged, the Meuse-Argonne casualty rate approached 20%, a figure that in European terms would have characterized the battle as a disaster requiring months of recovery. But the American Army didn't require months of recovery. By November 1918, there were 2 million American soldiers in France, with more arriving weekly. The divisions destroyed in the Meuse-Argonne could be replaced. The casualties could be absorbed. The offensive could continue indefinitely. This was the ultimate expression of the mathematics that Pershing had intuited. In a war of attrition between industrialized nations, victory goes not to the side with superior tactics, but to the side that can sustain losses longer than the enemy can sustain hope. The American experience in World War I presents a paradox that troubled military analysts for decades afterward. The American Army fought with doctrine that any objective assessment would characterize as obsolete and counterproductive. American commanders ignored lessons that European armies had learned at the cost of millions of casualties. American tactics resulted in casualty rates that should have been strategically unsustainable. Yet the American Army achieved its strategic objectives, contributed decisively to Allied victory, and validated Pershing's insistence on maintaining an independent American command committed to offensive operations. The resolution of this paradox lies in understanding that military effectiveness is not a purely technical question. By 1918, the Western Front had become not primarily a tactical problem, but a psychological and industrial one. The tactical problems, how to break through prepared defenses, how to exploit breakthroughs, how to sustain offensive operations, had been largely solved by European armies through innovations in artillery tactics, infiltration techniques, and combined arms coordination. But these solutions required armies with veteran troops, experienced officers, and most critically, the psychological resilience to continue fighting after years of slaughter. The American Army possessed none of these tactical advantages. But it possessed something that by 1918 mattered more: industrial capacity to equip armies at a scale that dwarfed European production, manpower reserves that could replace casualties indefinitely, and most critically, psychological freshness born of late entry into the war. American soldiers still believed that their cause was just, that victory was possible, and that their sacrifices mattered. German soldiers, after 4 years of war, believed none of these things. Pershing's doctrine of open warfare, with all its tactical flaws, exploited this psychological asymmetry. By emphasizing offensive operations regardless of casualties, by attacking continuously rather than in carefully planned set-piece battles, by treating losses as acceptable costs rather than disasters requiring operational pauses, American doctrine amplified the one advantage America possessed: the capacity to endure losses that would break the enemy's will before breaking its own. This made the American contribution to Allied victory less a matter of tactical innovation than psychological and industrial attrition. The American Army didn't teach European armies how to fight more effectively. It didn't introduce revolutionary tactics or technologies. Instead, it introduced into the equation of war a massive new factor: American industrial production and American manpower, that changed the strategic calculation for German high command. The Germans could see that even if they won every tactical engagement against American forces, they would eventually lose the war because America could replace its losses and Germany could not. November 12, 1918. Dawn. Corporal Frank Seibold of the 82nd Division sat in a muddy trench north of Sedan and learned that the war had ended. Around him, survivors of his company, 41 men from the 250 who had entered the Argonne 6 weeks earlier, received the news in exhausted silence. They had taken Hill 269, the objective of that catastrophic attack in October, though not through the frontal assault that had failed so bloodily. They had eventually flanked the German positions, forcing the defenders to withdraw. The hill had cost the company 189 casualties. Seibold would return to teaching in Georgia. He would never speak much about the war except to say that it had been necessary and that the men who died had not died in vain. He would tell students that American soldiers had fought with courage and determination, and that these qualities had won the war. He wouldn't tell them about the bodies in the wheat fields at Belleau Wood, or the screaming wounded on the slopes of the Argonne, or the friends who died because officers ordered frontal attacks against machine gun positions. He wouldn't explain that the war had been won not through superior tactics, but through superior capacity to absorb punishment, or that American doctrine had treated his life and his friends' lives as expendable resources in a larger strategic calculation. He couldn't explain these things because he didn't fully understand them himself. He knew only what he had experienced, that he and men like him had been sent forward again and again, had suffered terrible losses, and had eventually prevailed. The mathematics of why this approach succeeded, the industrial capacity, the manpower reserves, the psychological exhaustion of the enemy, remained invisible to him. He experienced only the human cost. That cost was the hidden price of Pershing's doctrine. American forces suffered 320,000 casualties in 6 months of major combat operations, with 53,000 killed in action. These casualties were not the unavoidable price of modern warfare. They were the specific consequence of tactical doctrine that emphasized offensive spirit over combined arms coordination, that treated casualties as proof of determination rather than evidence of flawed tactics, and that relied on industrial and manpower advantages to overcome tactical deficiencies. A different doctrine, one that incorporated the lessons European armies had learned, could have achieved the same strategic objectives at lower cost. But that different doctrine might not have broken German morale. The relentless, seemingly heedless American attacks succeeded precisely because they were tactically crude and costly. They succeeded because they demonstrated to German defenders that the American army would continue attacking regardless of losses, that American casualties would be replaced, and that German defensive skill could delay, but not prevent ultimate defeat. The psychological impact of this demonstration, of an enemy willing and able to absorb punishment indefinitely, may have mattered more than tactical efficiency. This is the uncomfortable truth about American participation in World War I. Tactical incompetence became strategic effectiveness because America possessed resources that allowed it to treat soldiers' lives as expendable inputs in an industrial calculation. The same doctrine that killed Frank Seibold's friends broke the German army's will. The mathematics that measured American casualties in 6-figure totals also measured the tonnage of supplies, the replacement rate of divisions, and the psychological endurance of the enemy. In this mathematics of industrial warfare, Pershing's primitive doctrine of open warfare became a weapon precisely because it was primitive, because it reduced war to its simplest elements of mass, momentum, and willingness to pay any price for the offensive. The teachers and farmers and shopkeepers who died in the forests and fields of France in 1918 died proving that in modern industrial war, victory goes not to the side that fights most skillfully, but to the side that can endure loss most completely. They died teaching the German army that American resources were effectively infinite, American determination unshakable, and American willingness to sacrifice unlimited. They died making Pershing's theory of open warfare appear to succeed, not because the theory was sound, but because American industrial and demographic capacity made it sustainable long enough to break the enemy's psychology. Their blood became the currency that purchased not tactical victory, but strategic collapse. The final proof that in war between industrial nations, mathematics matters more than tactics, and the side with larger reserves always wins the arithmetic of attrition.